All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Eternal Patch Breakdown number 3 for the last 30 days, I think. So we have a new batch of changes to the Eternal Draft Packs, which of course also means a change to Expedition. And it's a pretty good set of changes. So I would say that what has happened here is that the major balance changes to Expedition following the ECQ have come out, instead of being in one big patch, over 3 small patches over the course of the last week or so. So first we had like the nerfs to cultists and other options. We had the addition of the Expedition archives. I actually don't remember which of those two happened first, but then so we had the Expedition archives where we had the new cards being added into the pool from different special campaigns. We had the changes to the basic just general meta, where we had nerfs to Slumbering Stone, nerfs to Makar, that kind of thing. And now we have finally a changeover of the draft packs, where the draft packs are getting updated, and also we're seeing a flip around of them. It is not a huge change in comparison to some of the draft pack changes that we have had, but we are seeing a good 7 or 8 cards being added to each setup, as well as a pretty drastic change to how packs are weighted, which, if you didn't know packs are weighted, join the club. It is a sentence that was in, I believe, the one of the previous announcements, but I actually did not know that, despite having a pretty good time with draft and basically getting master, I think, every single time that Flame of Zolta draft. I think, yeah, we've gotten mastered every Flame of Zolta draft so far, but I didn't know the packs were weighted, and now I found out that the weighting is increasing to 5x. So yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit, and we're going to talk about all of the different changes. So first things first, Eternal Draft Packs are switching to the first and fourth packs of draft. So you're going to see an Eternal Draft Pack, Flame of Zolta pack, Flame of Zolta pack, and then another Eternal Draft Pack. We've tried this draft format out. It's pretty fun. Flame of Zolta is a bit more interesting when it's glommed together, and also when you get some support cards first, and then you can sort of focus on whatever themes in the Flame of Zolta packs that you want to, and then get a couple more support cards to pick things up last. I think that that's a pretty interesting option. So the draft weighting used to be, apparently used to be 2 times as likely, but was 3x for quite some time. There are a number of different cards in the draft packs that, because they are particularly well suited to Flame of Zolta, will be weighted 5 times as often to show up in those packs over other cards in the draft packs, which is a really interesting thing that I think is generally good. It's good that we're seeing those cards more often, but it also means we have some interesting rarer cards that seem like they are commons but are not commons. There's kind of some poor signaling and messaging on that part, and I'm actually really generally opposed to that concept without some sort of indicator that the cards in the pack are weighted, because you're operating with no information inside the game about what kind of cards you are getting more copies of. So, for example, Static Bolt is in fact a weighted card in the new Eternal Draft Pack that is being added to the draft pack, but if you don't know that Static Bolt is heavily weighted, or if you have a card like Static Bolt that you want to collect a lot of, but it isn't weighted, you can make some pretty improper decisions based on that. You have to go to the website, you have to look at the specific list of what cards are in the pack. The list is not well formatted for that. So basically you'll have a column, the name of the card will be on the left, the rarity of the card will be on the right, and if the card is weighted, there will be a tiny asterisk next to it. It's real hard to read. You can't really take a good look at it. We have taken a good look at it, and there's some pretty interesting cards weighted there, but yeah, that is information that I just didn't know about. I missed that sentence in the update the last time that happened, and now I do know about it, and I'm somewhat irked. So, it's an unusual thing. I would say it's a very strange thing to be doing in general, so it's weird to be complaining about it now because it's been out for a while. But yeah, now that the cards are more weighted, I actually think that is a good change, because consistency is better, particularly when you think the cards are going to have a good influence on the meta. I'm not opposed to multiple kinds of rarity in draft packs. That seems kind of interesting, but it is certainly something that should be better messaged and better put out. Regardless, the new draft format is fun. Like, we're really enjoying it. I had a pretty good time with the first deck that we drafted. It did not do well, but we had a pretty good time with it anyways, and it felt like the cards were coming in a way that like we actually could very easily build the deck that we wanted to build, while also following good signaling and like just generally like keeping an eye on just doing all the things that are generally good for draft. We weren't led astray, I would say. Other people had very good draft decks as well, so we just ended up having a pretty bad run of luck. But I enjoyed the format so far, and I think I'm going to continue to enjoy it in the future. But yeah, messaging is definitely something that should be considered with these draft packs. So, other than that, like, yeah, draft format looks good. The other thing that we want to talk about here is the new changes to what's in the draft packs, since this matters a little bit for draft, but mostly for Expedition, because all cards in the draft packs are legal for Expedition. So let's go ahead and go over each of the cards in the list. We'll probably just open them up real quick and look at each one in turn. Some of these are not going to have a major impact. Some of them are going to have a little bit of impact. So first off, Bren's Scrying in Fire has been added. That's not particularly a big deal. It could possibly work with some scout or spell-based options, but by and large, never been a strong card, even in many formats that can like actually support it. Flamefang Charmer, a decent 2-drop with a good infiltrate, but probably not anything to write home about. At least it's an Oni for Oni Tribal. Grandfather's Axe, also not a card to write home about, but does have some Oni Weapon Tribal synergies. Definitely more of a draft card than anything. Ruins Guide, this is probably the first card that might actually see some play. I think there's a little bit of opening up for shift strategies in Shadow, Fire, and Time. I would not say they're tier 1 decks, but that's certainly an option available if you're so inclined. Iceberg Scattershot. This card has been added, which it's a pretty fun card with a number of different triggers, including a very good card with Bren. We might see some Bren combo coming out from Iceberg Scattershot, or some other interesting forms of combo coming out of that deck. Depending on how good the combo is, that's how good the card will be. Removal's still a little bit scant, so this might be something that could actually see a lot more play in Expedition than it has in Throne. And it saw some play in Throne for like Westwind Herald combo and that kind of thing. Factory Quota, an interesting aggro card that shuts off life gain. Good answer to cultists, good answer to basically a large variety of interesting options, and potentially something you could maybe piddle with if you were playing with the 8 cost that switches health. I don't know. There's a couple of interesting options there. It's unusual. It's not an amazing aggro card, but it could potentially work out if things trend towards controlling. Thus far, they have not been controlling, but looking at what changes are happening, we are going to see some changes to that in particular. Godan Undefeated is available, as are all 5 of the cycle, and Godan, while not being so amazing, is nonetheless a very large Oni, so a good supporter for Oni Tribal, and also a card that gives you just a ton of value on a unit that's somewhat hard to remove that costs 5. So lots of good stuff going on there, certainly not unreasonable. We'll see if Godan can find a place in like a warp-based strategy, but it might take a little bit more than that to get something like that going. Phase Out. Choose unit, shift it. Solid enough removal for like very fast-paced decks. Could be interesting in an aggro setup. Pack Beast allows you to get extra power this turn, so ramps actually not unreasonable, although there's really good ramp in Expedition already. Tremor Shocker, big ol' unit, doesn't really go in Expedition, but it is a fun draft card, so certainly going to see a lot of that. Expedition Leader, this one is more shift benefits, and there's a couple of these cards in Time as well as Shadow, so there were already quite a few shift cards in Expedition. Again, this might be pushing shift into Expedition as an option. Trickster Mage, warp and shift benefits. Not too many warp cards in the setup, but nonetheless with the addition of like Bren's Scrying and all of the different warp monocolored cards, there's some potential for this card to see a little bit of play, and it's also a shift benefit card. Sandstorm Scarf, this is just a cool one to get in out of a market and turn off flyers. Could be a solid answer to Huru for some of the decks that are going to get shut down by Huru. I think Elysian oftentimes doesn't have an amazingly strong answer to it, so could be a decent choice there in the market for Great Valley Smugglers. Zumaken the Surveyor gets us that 7/7 with the giant ability. This card's pretty strong in Expedition. I think it actually will see play. Really, really ridiculous stat line, and just a very big card with good card advantage. Probably going to see some play, although notably doesn't have any interactions with Makar, who is, or Carvet, And if that deck is still popular, then less Zumakin is likely. Justice, Flash Grenade. We don't even really need to talk about that one. It's basically just for draft. Spellstrike Sorceress, also probably just for draft and a bad card to boot. Tauride Test Pilot, that is a 1/4, pay 2 and twist. Once again, probably mostly just gonna see play in draft. There are a couple of like twist benefit cards now, and like even some twist support in the form of, I believe, the 3/3 that gives an extra twist to everything. So could be good in like a Yisha type setup, but seems unlikely. And now we're into the big ones. Defiance is back. Kill an attacking enemy unit with cost 2 or less. Stun an attacking enemy unit with cost 3 or more. And costs 1, of course. So Defiance got nerfed recently, probably about a month or two ago, and I would say that, like, straight up, like, that is something that was a very good change for Throne, and also a pretty good change in anticipation of this particular expedition meta. The addition of Defiance, to my eyes, is a very good change. This is a card that answers basically the chief problem that I have with Expedition meta right now, which is that it is very, very snowball-y based off of like just really simple 2-drops. So things that Defiance answers that are really kind of cheaty and need to have some risk associated with them include Teething Whelp. You have the Monk that has 3/1 and Overwhelm. You have Trailmaker with Sodi's Spell Shaper. You have Verit, which I have talked at length about how much I think that Verit is like a really nonsense card. Like, Defiance makes Verit a lot more tolerable in the meta because there's an actual good answer to it that also punishes people for playing Jack's Knife on a wide variety of mastery units. It also gets the Combrade 3/3, the Minotaur that was so particularly strong in that setup. All of these cards are cards that you want to punish, and using a 1-cost spell defensively to kill an attacking enemy unit at 2 is perfectly fair, and I would say not overpowered. It's something that you want to run so that you can basically like keep the meta in check, but it isn't something that's going to solely win Justice those games, and it isn't something that's going to not allow for more interaction later in the game. But it does mean that you have to be a lot more careful about playing Jack's Knives on things and Caleb's Persuaders on things and Sodi's Spell Shapers on things, all of which were cards that previously might have been considered to be like very, very overpowering in the early meta. This also kills Nahid's Faithful, so the big stack up of Nahid's Faithful and Shadowlands guides, that's something else that it answers. There's just a lot of units in the game right now that are basically just like really good 1 and 2 drops, and very frequently the Expedition meta was terminating at 4 with Makar or some other 4-drop. So like, this is something that actually allows decks to see the late game. Now we can see a little bit more mid-range, we can see a little bit more control. I think that's a fine change, and I'm pretty happy with it. Vanquish has also come back. That one's an interesting punishment for like Kairos-based decks. If you want to slow the game down, Vanquish is an interesting check on that. That just basically says that you can't play too many 6/6s and get away with all of them. This is a perfectly reasonable card at 3. It's not very powerful. It probably won't see a lot of play, but it is something that you can at least use as a check against like big Kairos decks and those kinds of like larger threats, which are going to see a little bit more play now that Defiance is in at 1. So I like those two changes as like straight up meta changes. I think those are the two most important things that got released, while not being like extremely strong for Justice, which already had a pretty strong Huru list going on and a lot of interesting aggressive options. This allows Justice to transition into mid-range and control, and it also allows a lot of other decks with Justice in them to transition to mid-range and control without Justice being the power or focus of those decks. So yeah, I think that's a very solid change overall. Minotaur Platemaker. Less enthused about this one. This card is very, very powerful, is very, very powerful in Throne, and is very, very powerful with Yisha and Seraph and a wide variety of other creatures, while also being very, very powerful on its own. It's a super good 4-drop. Like, there's not a lot of reasons for Justice not to be playing it, and it is also just really hard to deal with, particularly in this whole setup. So Yeah, not wild about this one. This one actually makes silence kind of more of a pressing problem, and there aren't many good silence cards for a Minotaur Platemaker. Like Grodoff at 6/5 is kind of okay. Like there's some interesting options, but I would say that by and large this card is just going to be absolutely ridiculous in the format. Saditi the Killing Steel is also back, since of course the whole cycle is back. Not a big fan of this one either. That card is too large and also has that Curse of Provocation, which, while doesn't trigger very often now, is still pretty irritating. Never really liked Saditi, so not a big fan of it, but it is powerful and certainly will potentially open up some monocolored Justice decks. Primal. Primal gets Dragon Breath, which is a reasonable removal option that also allows for some interesting mastery triggers and some interesting dragon triggers. Overall, pretty happy with this card being in the list. It seems like a great mastery card, should be a lot of fun to play with, and also synergizes pretty well with Primal while also not synergizing very well with the current Primal deck, which is spell damage. Like, this card, I believe, doesn't benefit from spell damage. That one's changed before, so I don't remember which way it is right now. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it doesn't benefit from spell damage, but it does trigger masteries and also do some other interesting stuff. So it's a cool card, a good removal card, or rather a bad enough removal card that you shouldn't be too worried about it. Static Bolt, however, is a little bit more worrying. While one of my favorite cards in draft packs, and I'm pretty excited to see it in a draft pack that weights it 5 times as much, I would say that this is an interesting card for Expedition, to say the least, seeing as Prodigious Sorcery has not been nerfed yet, and that card is basically on the border of being very broken in both Throne and Expedition. This seems like a very likely recipe for disaster. I'm real worried about this one. I do love Static Bolt though, and I always want to see it in Expedition and in Ranked. So like, nerf Prodigious Sorcery, please. Let me keep my Static Bolts. I'm glad to see it in the set, even if I'm really worried about the things that might happen. Slip Sergeant. Pretty annoying draft card, not really an Expedition card. Fun with Yetis, and actually does enable Yetis to maybe do something with their bargain. So maybe something cool could come out of that, but by and large, probably not going to make too much of an impact on the meta. Island's Intervention. This one's actually probably going to be a sleeper for a lot of people, but negating a 3-cost enemy spell, which negates all the displays, by the way, killing units with flying, and also giving benefits to Yetis. I like all of these. I'm a big fan of Island's Intervention. It's a fun card. There's a lot of good uses for the different modes, and it's nice to have that choice available. I think this is a cool thing to have, and also, since all of the displays, all 5 of them, are coming in, that seems like a pretty interesting choice. Jotun Punter, pretty obnoxious draft and Expedition card. Could see some play in Expedition. Seems unlikely, but draft-wise, this is just like a really interesting pick that tends to allow you to pick Yetis very well. This is pretty dominant as a strategy and can often like override a lot of the good things going on with other setups. So I'm a little worried about it in draft just because it kind of like washes out some of the Flame Azulta options, but it's fine for this to come back in. It's a pretty strong addition to Primal overall. Scouting Party's back. That's a pretty interesting one to see in a draft pack. A lot of good card draw out of it, a lot of good spells. Again, like, I don't mind seeing this card, but it is pretty powerful. We could definitely see some cool stuff out of it. Not too big of a deal. Roast, probably the most terrifying in the 5 that is coming back. The Walking Glacier. Yeah, Overwhelmed Warp, Entomb, Play Shifted, 7/7. All of this is very, very nasty. I think there's a way to give Roast Exalted. I don't know what it is, but I'm pretty sure there's a method, and then it like gives a 7/7 weapon while entombing, which is that's fun. That's cute. Yeah, this card's really nasty, and there's not a lot of good ways to deal with it in Expedition. I think Primal's probably going to make very good use of this. Primal probably needed a few power points in places that weren't spell damage, so it's fine to see that. But like, yeah, I also want to see like I don't really love seeing this card again, so we'll see. Shadow, not getting too much on Shadow. We got Muck Crawler, +2/+2 while you have a shifted unit. Again, shift is coming back in a pretty big way. Target Color gives quick draw to things. That's a decent aggro option. Still has that double Shadow influence, which is a bit restrictive, but could potentially be useful. Stonescar Outfitter, a card that I love and a great shift card. This is really fun in draft, and I've always liked it in draft. It should really like reopen a bunch of those sort of strategies. Expedition-wise, might see some play. Seems seems doubtful, but you never really know. Death Ripple, that's going to be a pretty good removal card since it kills all of the listeners and also basically everything that everyone has been playing in Expedition up to this point. Like I said, the deck tended to top out at 4, so this is another potential meta change that might allow for some 5-drops and 6-drops to actually get into the meta. So seems interesting and buffs a bunch of shift-based aggro strategies, which might actually be enough to get shift-based aggro in there. Stained Honor Twist is coming back as well, so yeah, maybe we'll see a little bit more Twist. Could be interesting. I'm still worried that it's just going to be that Seraph deck, so we'll see. Lurking Sanguar, this is a degenerate aggro card, and I will have none of it, but okay, it's back in Expedition. Tazbu, the Forbidden, 6/6 Deadly Warp, another extremely strong warp card, and another strong reason to go into a Mono Shadow or Mono Primal deck. I think that, like, basically there are some pretty good options here if you want to go into monocolor now. They are really supporting monocolor with these legendaries, but not with too much else. So yeah, there's some potential for cards like Tazbu to be played. I think it is definitely strong enough to be seen in Expedition and could definitely lead the charge at, like, just basically like pushing out sort of a slower type of meta. It's a really, really powerful card. We'll see how oppressive it ends up. I think all 5 of the Warp Radiants at 5 have potential to be quite broken, but it's going to sort of depend on where the removal lines up and what all we see in response. Finally, no major hybrid cards added with the exception of Display of Instinct, Display of Ambition, Display of Honor, Display of Vision, and Display of Knowledge. Did you know that, like, Quinn and Grinva and other cards were actually in this format? Because I don't think that anyone was playing 3-color for those particular cards, apart from a couple of decks that managed to do Mastery with Grinva for a little while. Cards like Displays are super necessary for helping those particular decks out, so that's a pretty interesting option. Display of Instinct is going to be particularly worrying because of the Prodigious Sorcery deck. I think that Display of Honor has some actual chances at being good in a format that has a large number of exalted units, as well as, like, a lot of reasons to, like, give lifesteal to things. I think that this card's actually, like, really on the verge of being the more powerful card over Display of Knowledge, which has previously been extremely good, and Display of Ambition, which has also previously been extremely good. But both of these ones are a little bit more value focused and also a little bit more relic focused, and relic focus seems a little less likely to be good even with Display of Knowledge in the format. Display of Ambition still going to be an amazing card, does kill a lot of different good things, and also give you a lot of value. This could potentially be a pretty broken and ridiculous option. Display of Vision seems like it might get played, but I can't say much more than that for its value in the meta. It's got another little bit of a -1/-1 on it, so if you want to play like Argenport with E-Laws and Display of Vision, you could maybe do some weird things there. The Attachment Destruction is kind of handy, and the Power card, of course, is very, very good if you want to ramp up to some of those bigger options like Omri Dragonsbane or the second Grinva, but by and large this card is mostly just a role player and not like a meta staple of any kind. So yeah, like that is all of the cards that are being added in the draft packs and also being added to Expedition. I would say that these represent a pretty significant shift in the meta and also the opening of a lot of different new options for both Pauper and for competitive decks. In like the cheaper and like sort of more casual formats, I expect to see a lot more shift. I expect to see a lot more like interesting Oni weapons stuff. I expect to see some nice 3-color decks coming back, and like generally I think people are going to be able to make better use of the cards that they have without having to build like a lot of specific like tournament competitive decks that are very oriented around like just those particular cultists or particular dragons that you absolutely have to have. Competitively, I think this probably upends the meta enough to actually make a difference and make for an interesting Expedition again. I am very keen to see what happens. I'm really excited to see like basically all of the Mastery barrel rolls go away and finally get at least some good answers in the form of Defiance and Death Ripple and the displays. Like that just seems like something that's really going to make the general experience of Expedition a lot better. So I'm pretty happy to see all of that as well. And while some people are pretty mad about the Defiance change, I for one wholeheartedly support it. I think that that's a really, really good addition, particularly since Defiance has already been nerfed, as has Vanquish as well. overall, I would say that Primal is the biggest winner here. Shadow's addition of Tazbu alone might be something that really increases the strength of monocolored decks, and monocolored decks in general have like a lot of interesting options available as a result of this. Most of the current meta decks that are very, very good are gonna get a little bit worse, and I think the meta is going to slow down a little bit as a result of these particular setups. What decks become good, it has yet to be seen, but there's a really interesting pile of cards here, and I'm pretty excited to see if any of them get played in some interesting ways. That is it. Thank you so much for watching. As always, we're on Twitch. You can find us there. We're also on Patreon and YouTube, so feel free to subscribe. And if you have your Amazon Prime, you can subscribe on your Twitch as well for free, which is pretty good as well. Thank you again, and have a lovely evening, everyone. I hope you enjoy the new cards and have a lovely, lovely time with them. Cheers.